I'm Karin Dubsky from Coastwatch, and I've also, like Cormac, been part of the advisory group, and I'm also a director in Swan. Go back to what Connor said, first of all, about the National Marine Planning Framework. And it says, what is marine spatial planning? And I just want to quote from it. It's a process that brings together multiple users of the ocean to make informed and coordinated decisions about how to use marine resources sustainably. But if you, initially when I read that, I thought, this sounds worrying. Where is ecology? But thankfully, there is a piece of legislation which was already passed in 2018 and was commenced in November of 2018, which is the Planning and Development Act 2018. And part 5 of that Planning and Development Act deals with the maritime spatial planning. And in it, it is very nicely written, and that it is the objectives of the marine spatial plan are to analyze and organize activities in the maritime area for the purpose of achieving ecological, economic, and social priorities. So that's why it's so important. It's to also achieve, and that's as a first iteration, the ecological priorities. So I won't actually follow my PowerPoint fully. Everyone knows 2020 and the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the Sustainable Development Goals, we have SDG 14, which is life below water. And if you look at the 10 targets, which tell you whether you have achieved good status, whether you have a healthy ocean, 4 of the 10 mature in 2020. And sadly, or by 2020, including what Cormac already said, the having at least 10% of our sea area protected as marine protected area. Now, Ireland doesn't have that. Ireland is didn't reach any of the 4 targets. So from our point of view as environmental groups, I think it is very important to highlight this. You know, on my slide, I have the lists of the targets, and I have underlined in yellow the ones which mature now, and none of those have been reached. So you have to ask yourself, will this plan help us to reach those targets? Because the EU directive says that it will. And how quickly will it? So that's one of the sort of thing which we would all, even if you're just thinking of your local area, of your county, of your bay, how could this plan, on your opinion, help make either restore ecology or protect it? And I think the more we can populate things with concrete examples, the more concrete it becomes for them to try and see, oh yeah, are we actually covering this? So that's the main thrust of what I'm going to say. That is where local people can come in, because locally, we often have more information than somebody sitting in the national office. That doesn't mean that we're necessarily against a national coordination group, but we need to make sure that the offshore energy companies who walk in and out of that department with a little map showing where exactly they want to be, that the officials also have a map in their head where you are and what your concerns are and how that plan is to help resolve your issues or our issues. And those issues could be, I want to restore the ray and skate populations in my area or the salmon populations. So you can be quite specific, and then you can get the backup, and any of us can also help you in the next few days with that. Okay, next. I'm really responding to some degree to what Connor said. Remember the slide which he had, which was overarching government policy. And on the right-hand side, he had the planning on land. And then on the left-hand side, he had the marine. And I don't know whether you started getting lost at the bottom end. But so at the top end, you can see the top policy statements. But as you go further down, you can see that it's getting more and more vague. So for example, at the bottom end, he had the things which at the local level, on the right-hand side, local area plans. And then on the left-hand side, coastal partnerships and bay area plans. I don't know if any of you have been involved in local area plans, but I have been, and I find it frustrating how little clout they have. And for example, village plans, they can be totally overridden. And therefore we have to dive into how much power do local plans have? How can they be enforced? Are they enforceable, or are they just more like guidelines? Because that's really important for us. So it's dive down to the local level. There was one thing which maybe in a way is something good to tell. When this document was being developed, we were pushing really hard that, you see, at the moment there's an incentive not to designate any more marine protected areas, because this way you can allow big industry like offshore renewable to go wherever they want, more or less, because you've designated very few areas which are difficult for them. But there's one piece which did get in, which was on page 40, no, it wasn't. 1 second, there's one on marine protected areas, and I have just closed that page, which says that features, which actually, sorry, I have it in my PowerPoint, which is much better. Features which are not yet protected, but which might be needed to complete the network of marine protected areas should be treated as though they were protected. Now, the wording isn't exactly like that, but it does mean that features which are not protected, like kelp forests and seagrass beds, would feature in this plan. So in principle, this is a really good thing. On the downside, we don't actually have the maps of these. So when you're making your own proposal for this, try and mention, say that this is very good, so that they don't get tempted to take it out, and then give a local example. So in Coastwatch, for example, about 1/3 of all the seagrass beds are not in the official National Parks and Wildlife Service or EPA maps, but they are now hopefully going to be included. And just in case they're not, we're going to include our maps. And those were brought in by local people, by locals who accidentally or by design found those seagrass beds and told us. So the next really important thing is implementation and enforcement. How are we going to make sure, because I think several of you already brought that up during the meeting. How are we going to make sure that implementation and enforcement really has enough bump? Because that is the weakest area. And when you saw Connor's answer on an appeal mechanism, I think Bernie asked that question. He was not, he was really looking at different ways of answering it, but he was pretty open as well to say, we don't know yet. Well, if we don't know yet, let's try as NGOs to suggest ways which would be fair, accessible. And, if you're looking at the moment, we have ALAB for aquaculture applications. We have on board Panola for planning applications. But offshore, for those big wind turbines, we have High Court. Maybe it would be a good idea, I don't know what you think, on having one composite appeals body, which then has different units within it, which look at different licenses. But definitely at the moment, it is a serious problem and a drain on state resources to have all these different appeals, ways of appealing, with different secretariats, different amount of expertise, in different parts of the country. So that could be a concrete thing to come from us. Let me just check when, sorry, let me just open it out again. Yeah, maybe just another plug for citizen science. Our seas are changing very quickly, and climate change has the biggest impact in the coastal zone. Our estuary, if you're looking at the last report by Ireland, by the National Parks and Wildlife Service to Europe on marine habitats, there were not only not in good status, but several which had been moderate but improving have now turned to going into bad. And therefore it's really, really important that we have as many people on the ground as citizen scientists watching what is happening on cumulative effects and on climate change, together with some of the other effects. So for example, in the Waterford estuary, you might have climate change, but additionally, you have got heat from a power station coming down, as well as nuking. And I would like to ask you if you could check it in your areas. I understand that to comply with the Bathing Water Directive, some of the local authority discharges now are being chlorine bombed, bleach bombed in the summer months, which has devastating effects on the intertidal and shallow biota. There was no policy on this, it just seemed to happen. So those cumulative effects, some of them are not written down. They are literally in your area. They have to be highlighted and they have to be managed locally. And citizen science is very, very important. We are proposing on our side that in the Marine Atlas, which Cormac referred to, should be used as an interim, there should be a layer for citizen science, so that if official bodies don't quick enough add some information, at least it's already publicly available in our citizen science layer. Let me just those were examples. And then, yeah, maybe just one other thing. When this plan was drafted, even 6 months ago, there was a totally different economic picture. And now with COVID-19, I'm really concerned that we may not be looking at proper implementation and enforcement. And I think it would be really important to say how one could have good implementation and enforcement even with a low budget. And then I have some examples on that, which you can see later in my presentation. And so just to recap on key issues. The plan as it stands doesn't appear to look at existing structures. It's almost as though everything which exists is okay. Well, it isn't necessarily okay at all. There are some fish farms and some aquaculture which definitely should be queried. So there isn't a mechanism for that, and we think that it's really important to have that in there, particularly when it's illegal, as in Lough Foyle, where not a single aquaculture operator is operating with a license. So we should not take it as a fait accompli that they're there, but we should look at what should transboundary management look like if they weren't there. Then on the cumulative impacts, very, very important to look at that. Climate change, citizen science, already said. I don't know how many of you are working with the Aarhus Convention, but I think if everybody could try and mention the Aarhus Convention on access to environmental information, public participation, and access to justice. So that's AARHUS. It's a lovely bedtime reading, by the way. And this would be a really important thing. If we all have it there in some guise, it would be very, very useful to strengthen the document. One or two of the other things which I noticed so far, they might be further back in the system. So some things can be sorted in local planning. you know, for example, we need a local planning where, like the marina, or whether you do or don't need a marina, but where these particular features are. Other things should be done on a national level and integrated, like a national erosion management policy. Ireland has a very high threat of erosion. Local people are screaming for it. I estimate that 3 out of 4 erosion projects are either illegal or were put in without any permission and are in retrospect granted retention. So something has to happen on erosion. At the moment, that is not covered in the plan. And then there are some things which probably need to be added, but I don't know whether any of you are interested in it, like microbes, the Bathing Water Directive and Shellfish Water Directive, which also look at bacteria and viruses like the norovirus, the COVID-19, coronavirus, our E. coli, fecal strep. All of that is not covered, needs to be covered. Okay, this is just a very quick run through some things. Once you have the slides, it'll be easier to understand, but I leave it there so that you could ask any questions.
Would you be able to cover something about the seaweed harvesting? There was a few questions about seaweed harvesting earlier.
Yeah, just brief outline. Coastwatch has a seaweed harvest policy, which is online. And we did some research with a wonderful Marinella, wonderful 6 months intern who we had. And we got a lot of feedback from traditional seaweed harvesters. So there are several hundred active seaweed harvesters in the country, some of them for so-called sea vegetable harvesting, which is, you know, for eating and so on. But the majority and the bulk would be for maybe 2 or 3 species, mainly egg rack, also some kelp. And that would be for 2 companies, the bigger company being the one, Aramara, on the West Coast. The traditional seaweed harvesters either have a right to harvest in their land folio, or they may have it listed in somebody else's folio, as I have on Saltmarsh I have, or they may have been doing it traditionally, but don't have it in any folio. There is a Property Registration Act which allows people to register traditional rights. However, when people have tried to register them, they were told by the land registry, no, you can't, because what are we going to register it if you don't have a folio? And this is state-owned foreshore. So for the past 2.5 years, we've been going around in circles. At the moment, a lawyer who has worked very kindly with Coastwatch is trying to go through one complete case and be formally rejected in writing and then take it up. Unfortunately, this registering of your rights, it has a time limit on it, and therefore a lot of traditional fishermen are in a really bad way because time is running out and nobody is helping them. And then there's the other, which is the modern method with the Canadian seaweed boats, the so-called blue boats, which were brought in by the Canadian company, which bought the Irish Aramara company. These boats are 10 meters, and under Irish law, if you are below, or they're just below 10 meters, you don't need any particular harvest license. So these boats are going without any license, except for that they have a certificate of seaworthiness. They're going into the areas of traditional fishermen. We've got now, over the last few days, several calls. And we have asked them to go and contact the National Parks and Wildlife Service if it's a protected area. The National Parks and Wildlife Service has now come back in writing to say, if these people applied for a license to harvest in protected areas, we would comment. And it is up to the department, or to the foreshore section of housing, to ask them to apply for a license. But the foreshore section is not asking them to apply for a license. And Sea Fishery Protection Agency doesn't have the power to stop people who are harvesting seaweed. So you have gaps, really serious gaps, where things are happening right in front of our noses. And questions, those are really important, because it's not just whether somebody harvests seaweed, but it's also the ecosystem which is being wrecked for umpteen other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does seem like a lot of circles there that people are running around in. Even just what you were describing there seems quite disjointed. So would it be, well, mentioning obviously in this submission that an individual will be putting in, mentioning your own concerns with seaweed harvesting, but then maybe pointing them towards the Coastwatch seaweed harvesting policy? Would that be worthwhile as well?
Yeah, or else they can also contact me if it's a particular area. And the more you have specific examples where the legislation doesn't seem to be enforceable, there's a gap, the better.
And Elizabeth is just asking, are these boats dredgers?
No, it's a funny method where they have a long rake and they rake up the seaweed. But in compared to the traditional where they are walking in the intertidal, the boats can get to areas where the others don't get to. And they can take far more, because the intertidal guys can only work at certain times of tide, really only for 3 hours per tide. The boats can work at all tides. And they can take a lot more than the others. So your taking away of biomass is increased. They also take more animals which are on the seaweeds. And they can, if it's boulder, depends on the shore, but if it's a shore with boulders, they sort of pull the boulder up with the rake, and then the boulder bounces back onto the ground. And if it lands upside down, the seaweed dies. If it's egg can regrow from a little piece, but not if it's upside down on the sediment. So in the areas, which I've only looked at 2 areas where they're doing it, you definitely have a significantly bigger impact than when you have a traditional seaweed harvester who knows that it's their own area and they go gently at it. You have some commonage areas which are being badly overharvested as well, using the traditional method.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really comes down to giving people who know and care for the resources the ability to harvest them over people who don't. For the last 10 minutes, I'd just like to invite Cormac to answer these questions as well, so we can get both of you in on this. There's one here from Jeshua. How can local people access information about potentially valuable habitats in their area that need to be protected for future MPA network, i.e. seagrass beds?
That's Karin. Coastwatch, definitely.
So at the moment, that sort of information is dispersed all over the place. Yes, we have some Coastwatch information, and if it's marine protected, if it's a Natura 2000 site, then look at the site synopsis and the data entry point, and that gives you some of the information. But for example, if you think of South Wexford, Kilmore Key, the SAC, SBA from Kilmore to the Salty Islands and so on. We found a massive, most amazing seagrass bed in that area, which wasn't even listed. So I would Google the place and keywords to see what comes up, because also there are quite a lot of student projects and masters and all sorts of things, which also include areas where there could be a good bit of information. But you're welcome to come to us if there's some particulars in your area. In fact, I know some particulars in your area.
Good stuff. And there's also just a note there from Olivia Feeney about the wastewater discharges. Irish Water regulate wastewater discharges. If a formal complaint is lodged to Irish Water, an investigative sample will be taken and will determine what parameters are present. So that's just a note on I guess, how to go about getting that tested in your area. Another question, does AI or O cover the marine? I'm afraid I don't know what that acronym is. AI or O from Trish.
Access to, hang on.
Sorry, Karen, that's the sensitivity mapping that's done by the Maynooth University. Does it cover marine?
I thought it was going to, but I haven't actually seen.
Yeah,
But
no, I haven't checked it lately. But...
No, neither have I. But I thought initially when they were talking about it, they were going to. Cormac, do you know?
I don't know, but I'm definitely going to look into it.
Yeah.
And would it, I mean, how do they accept data, Aero? I mean, are they gathering it themselves or can you submit to them?
I'm really not familiar with it at all, but I'm definitely going to look into it after this.
I know when we wanted to have some of our information, like the seagrass information, because I went out and verified every single bed, you know, and some people mix up seagrass and green seaweed and so on. And we wanted to have that included in the Marine Atlas. And it was really, really torturous to get it in. And I'm still not 100% sure that it will actually be in, but I think it's in.
Regina just made a good point in the chat that you can get a lot of this data from the MPWS website, but you might have to map it yourself if you want to overlap it with certain things.
That's if it's in a marine protected area, yeah, or for species which they have to report on, including your seals, Josh.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question if anyone else wants to ask anything. I'll give you a second. I know there's always a bit of a delay from when it's online. Okay, brilliant. So we have a final question there. On the planning model, Connor mentioned 3 options: shared service, hybrid or central. Any thoughts on that?
I would say hybrid.
Yeah, hybrid as well. This was trashed out in the advisory group too, and the consensus is for a hybrid model. You just have to be very careful about the parts that aren't zoned, how you regulate them. But yeah, the consensus is for hybrid.
Is there any way of elucidating on that, maybe from Swan for the members before the submissions go in? Because it would be good. It would be good if the submissions also included some direction in that area, I think, in a way, or preference in that way. I mean, they seem to put an awful lot of store in the National Planning Framework, and he seems to think it's a brilliant document, whereas, you know, we'd be a bit critical of some elements of it, but they're really trying to replicate that for the marine, and the regional element of the National Planning Framework works well through the regional assemblies. But again, we don't have any regional structure, so it's all starting from scratch in a way, unless you do it through something like the regional assembly structure. I don't know.
It might be logical to have, you know, 23 years ago, we developed this coastal zone management plan, bottom up, which included the government departments. And in it, our model was a central management authority. And then you would have those represented who had regional plans. And at the time, we thought that it might be good to have one for the Irish Sea, and then one for the South Coast, and one for the West Coast, and one for the North. So that you would have, and they would be more or less in line with the regional development authorities, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they would be, yeah. Yeah, so that model might work.
And then also, as far as possible, we didn't have water framework directive then, to also match it to any watersheds. So it would be really stupid if a local authority looked after its waters, because nearly every local authority owns half an estuary or quarter of a bay. So so you would have to work regionally to, you know, to work across these estuaries.
Yeah, so it would work with the catchment. It would work in dovetailing with the River Basin Management Plan as well,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah, I think so.